The cracked bell of Sanctuary Forks Church rang out across the valley, its broken voice carrying over red dust and dried sage. Each toll came uneven, sometimes sharp, sometimes muffled like a man trying to speak through a mouthful of sand. From her place at the back of the congregation, Rosalie Pike counted the irregular beats, her hands folded tight in her lap as her husband's voice rose from the pulpit. "The Lord tests us through drought and hardship," Jonah intoned, his black coat hanging loose on his frame. 3 years of poor harvests had thinned everyone in Sanctuary Fork, even the preacher. But we must not lose faith. We must not turn from righteousness when the path grows steep. Rosalie kept her eyes forward, though she felt the weight of sideways glances. Misses. Harwick's bonnet tilted just enough to catch a glimpse. Young Tom Brennan twisted in his pew until his mother smacked his shoulder. They all wanted to see if the preacher's wife would crack, would show some sign of the past they whispered about when they thought she couldn't hear. "Amen," the congregation murmured when Jonah finished, their voices as dry as the wind rattling the church windows. Outside, the September heat struck like an open oven door. Women gathered their children while men lit pipes and spoke in low voices about cattle prices and the railroad rumors. Rosalie moved through them with practiced ease, her gray dress modest but clean, her smile fixed but genuine enough to pass. "Mrs. Pike," May Lark called out, her voice cutting through the murmur. The widow ran the town's only boarding house, a 2-story building that leaned slightly east, as if trying to escape the desert wind. "That was a fine sermon your husband gave." "Thank you, May." Rosalie paused, reading something in the older woman's sharp eyes. May knew things always had. Running a boarding house meant collecting secrets like some women collected buttons. "Though I wonder," May continued, lowering her voice, "if the Lord's testing us, or if it's men doing the testing while blaming it on the Almighty." Before Rosalie could respond, Deacon Asa Crow appeared at Jonah's elbow. The man moved like oil on water, smooth and leaving a film on everything he touched. His black suit was the finest in town, his boots polished despite the dust that coated everything else. "Reverend Pike," Asa said, though his pale eyes fixed on Rosalie. "A word about the church finances, if you please." "Of course." Jonah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Rosalie, I'll meet you at home." She nodded, knowing a dismissal when she heard one. The walk to the parsonage took her past the general store, closed for the Sabbath, and the sheriff's office where Hale sat on the porch, badge catching the light. He touched his hat brim but said nothing. Sheriff Hale was a man who understood the value of silence. The parsonage squatted beside the church like a faithful dog, small but sturdy. Rosalie had made it a home with small touches curtains sewn from flour sacks, a garden that struggled against the drought but still produced enough beans and squash to share with neighbors. She moved through the familiar ritual of Sunday dinner, setting out cornbread and preserved peaches, the last jar from better times. Through the window, she watched dust devils spin across the valley floor. Beyond them, the dark line of trees marked Sanctuary Creek. Though it had run dry 2 months back, the widow Hutchins lived out that way with her 3 children, trying to scratch a living from soil that turned to powder at a touch. The door opened, and Jonah entered, bringing the smell of dust and something else worry, perhaps, or anger held too long in check. "Asa wants us to encourage the congregation to sell their creekside parcels," he said without preamble. "Says there's investors from back east interested in the land." Rosalie set down the water pitcher carefully. "Investors in dry creek beds." "That's what I asked." Jonah sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. He got that look, you know the one, like I'm a child who doesn't understand how the world works. She did know the look. Asa had perfected it, along with his way of making charity sound like judgment and help feel like chains. Rosalie served the cornbread, watching her husband's face. "The Hutchins family," she said carefully. Their land borders the creek, along with a dozen other families, the poor ones. Jonah's voice carried a bitterness she rarely heard. Asa says it's for their own good, says they can't farm dust. Might as well take the money and start fresh somewhere else. And go where with what? The words came sharper than she intended. Sarah Hutchins has 3 children under 10 and a husband 2 years in the ground. That land is all she has. I know. Jonah reached across the table, covered her hand with his. His fingers were ink-stained from writing sermons, calloused from helping repair the church roof. I told Asa we needed to pray on it. And he reminded me that the church needs a new bell, that the collection plate's been thin, that maybe it's time Sanctuary Fork had a preacher who understood the practical necessities of frontier life. The threat hung between them like smoke. Rosalie turned her hand palm up, laced her fingers through his. He can't remove you. The congregation. The congregation listens to whoever speaks loudest. Right now, that's Asa and his promises of prosperity. Jonah squeezed her hand once, then pulled away. I'll find another way. The Lord provides. After dinner, while Jonah retreated to his study, Rosalie stepped onto the porch. The evening brought little relief from the heat, but at least the sun wasn't beating down like a hammer on anvil. She saw May Lark walking past, probably heading to check on someone the woman had appointed herself Sanctuary Fork's unofficial nurse, midwife and keeper of confidences. May, Rosalie called softly. The older woman changed direction, climbed the porch steps with surprising agility for her 60 years. Thought you might want to talk, May said, settling onto the bench beside the door. Saw Asa cornering your husband. He wants the Creekside families to sell. Course he does. May pulled out a pipe. A scandal in itself for a woman. But May had stopped caring about propriety when her husband died 10 years back. You know, there's been surveyors out there thought they were being subtle. But I've got eyes. Surveyors for what? That's the question. Isn't it? May struck a match, puffed until the tobacco caught. Railroad men, maybe, or something else, but Asa Crow doesn't push this hard unless there's money in it for him. A child's cough echoed from somewhere in town, harsh and dry. Rosalie recognized the sound little Emma Brennan had been sick for a week, the dust aggravating her lungs. I should check on the Brennan girl, Rosalie said. Already did. Gave her mother some horehound tea. May studied Rosalie through the pipe smoke. You're a good woman. Rosalie Pike, don't let anyone tell you different. The words held weight, meaning Rosalie felt her spine stiffen. I don't know what. Sure you do. May stood, knocked her pipe against the porch rail. We all got pasts. Question is whether we let them define us or refine us. You've been refined. Far as I can see, but Asa Crow, he's the type who likes to dig up what's been buried, especially if it gives him leverage. After May left, Rosalie stood alone in the gathering dusk. From somewhere beyond the town limits came the sound of horses too many for regular travelers. Sheriff Hale would know about it soon enough. He kept track of who came and went, part of what made him a good lawman despite his tendency to avoid conflict when possible. The night brought the usual sounds: coyotes in the distance, the creak of wood contracting as it cooled, the whisper of wind through empty spaces, but underneath it all, Rosalie heard something else. Change was coming to Sanctuary Fork, riding in on promises and threats, wearing a deacon's smile and carrying secrets like ammunition. Inside, she found Jonah still in his study, surrounded by books and papers, his Bible open to Psalms. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the weight he carried not just of the town's souls, but of trying to be a good man in a world that rewarded compromise. Come to bed, she said softly. Soon, I need to prepare Wednesday's message. She moved behind his chair, placed her hands on his shoulders. The muscles there were knotted with tension. The message will come. It always does. Does it? He covered one of her hands with his. Sometimes I wonder if I'm speaking God's words or just my own fears dressed up in scripture. You're a good man. Jonah Pike, a good minister. Good men don't always make good leaders. Sometimes the flock needs a shepherd who knows when to use the rod. She leaned down, kissed the top of his head. His hair smelled of pomade and dust. The combination uniquely his, and sometimes they need a shepherd who knows when to stand between them and the wolves. Later, lying in their narrow bed, Rosalie listened to her husband's breathing slowly deepen into sleep. Through the thin walls came the sound of the damaged church bell settling in its tower, a small creak of protest against its own weight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges it always did in a place like Sanctuary Fork, where civilization was more hope than reality. But tonight, she had the warmth of her husband beside her, a roof over their heads, and the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. It wasn't much, perhaps, but it was more than she'd once dared hope for, more than a woman with her past had any right to expect. The coyotes called again, closer now, and somewhere in the darkness, a child coughed. Tomorrow, Rosalie would visit the Brennan family, regardless of what gossips might whisper. She'd check on the widow Hutchins too, see if the woman needed help with her harvest, such as it was. For now, though, she closed her eyes and let sleep take her, one hand resting on Jonah's arm, anchoring them both against whatever storms were brewing just beyond the horizon. The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, slipped under the parsonage door while Rosalie kneaded bread dough. No envelope, just a single sheet of paper folded twice, the creases sharp as accusations. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron before picking it up, already knowing it would bring no good news. The handwriting was deliberately crude, as if someone educated was trying to appear otherwise. But the message was clear enough. Mrs. Pike, your past sings louder than church bells. Convince your husband to support the land sales, or the whole town will hear your melody. You have 1 week. Rosalie read it twice, then held the paper over the stove flame until it caught. She dropped it into the iron pot, watching the words turn to ash and smoke. Her hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Something burning. Jonah appeared in the doorway, his face creased with concern. Just some paper caught on the stove. The lie came smooth as butter, and she hated herself for it. But what else could she say that someone knew about San Antonio, about the Crystal Palace and the songs she'd sung for miners and gamblers before finding salvation in a traveling preacher's tent? Jonah accepted her explanation, kissed her cheek, and returned to his study. Rosalie went back to her bread, punching the dough harder than necessary. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of being the preacher's wife, and now someone wanted to use her past as a weapon. That afternoon, she took a basket of preserves to May Lark's boarding house. The older woman was sweeping the porch, sending dust devils spinning into the street. You look like you've seen a ghost, May said, setting aside her broom. Just tired. Rosalie handed over the basket. These are for your guests. May's eyes narrowed. Come inside. I've got something to show you. The boarding house parlor smelled of tobacco and boiled cabbage. May led her to a small office behind the stairs, closing the door firmly before pulling out a ledger. Been keeping track of the land deeds, May said, flipping pages. Look at this. The entries were in May's neat script, recording every property transaction in Sanctuary Fork for the past year. Rosalie saw a pattern emerging: small parcels near the creek, all purchased by something called the Western Development Trust. Who owns this trust? Rosalie asked. That's the question, but yesterday I saw something interesting. May moved to the window, peering through the lace curtains. Asa Crow met with 2 men at the hotel. City men, by their clothes. They had maps. Maps of what? The whole valley. And Rosalie. May turned back, her weathered face serious. They were marking the creek bed with red ink. Not just the land beside it, the creek itself. Rosalie thought of the dry stream bed, the cracked earth where water once flowed. Why would anyone want railroad? May interrupted. Think about it. A natural path through the hills, already graded by God himself. All they'd need is to lay track. The implications hit Rosalie like a physical blow. If the railroad came through, those worthless creekside parcels would be worth fortunes. The poor families being pressured to sell would lose everything, while men like Asa Crow got rich. We need proof, Rosalie said. Proof's hard to come by when the powerful want secrets kept. May closed the ledger. But there's something else. That Witt ransom gang that's been terrorizing settlements to the north. Sheriff Hale got word they're moving this way. Outlaws and land grabs. What's next? Locusts. May's laugh was dry as dust. Don't give the Lord ideas. That evening, Rosalie found Jonah in the church, replacing hymn books in the pews. The late sunlight through stained glass painted him in reds and golds, making him look like a figure from the Old Testament. I've been thinking, she said, settling beside him on a bench. Dangerous habit. His smile was tired but genuine. About the land sales? What if there's more to it than helping poor families? Jonah's hand stilled on the hymnal. What do you mean? She chose her words carefully, sharing what May had shown her without revealing the threat she'd received. Jonah listened, his face growing darker with each detail. Western Development Trust, he repeated. Never heard of it. That's the point. Isn't it anonymous buyers, hidden purposes? She touched his arm. Jonah, what if Asa knows exactly what that land will be worth? What if he's helping steal from the very people we're meant to protect? That's a serious accusation. Is it an accusation if it's true? He was quiet for a long moment, then stood and walked to the pulpit. His fingers traced the carved wood, a gesture she'd seen him make when wrestling with difficult decisions. Even if it's true, what can we do? I'm one voice against Asa's influence. Half the church board follows his lead. Then be the voice, Rosalie urged. Someone has to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. And risk our position here, our home. He turned to face her. Rosalie, I know you care about these people, but we have to be practical. If I lose this church, we have nothing. The words stung more than they should have. She stood, smoothing her skirts. I thought we had our faith. I thought we had each other. Don't twist my words. Then don't abandon your calling. The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. The Jonah Pike I married would have fought for what's right, not what's safe. She left him there, walking home alone through streets painted purple by twilight. At the parsonage, she found another surprise Cole Mercer sitting on her porch steps, hat in his hands. Cole had arrived in Sanctuary Fork 6 months ago, a quiet man with watchful eyes and hands that knew their way around a gun. Rumor said he'd been a bounty hunter before finding religion, though Rosalie suspected his conversion had more to do with exhaustion than revelation. Evening, Mrs. Pike, he said, standing. Reverend around? At the church. Is something wrong? Cole shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Maybe not, but I owe your husband a debt, and I pay what I owe. Last winter, Jonah had vouched for Cole when Sheriff Hale wanted to run him out of town. Since then, the former gunman had worked odd jobs, keeping to himself but causing no trouble. What kind of debt requires a porch visit after dark? Rosalie asked. The kind that involves Witt Ransom's gang. Cole's voice dropped. I used to ride with Witt, years back, before I changed my ways. Got word they're planning something in these parts. Sheriff Hale knows they're in the area. Sheriff Hale knows they're coming. He doesn't know they've already got a man inside Sanctuary Fork, someone feeding them information about shipments, payrolls, who's got money and who doesn't. Rosalie felt cold despite the warm evening. Who? Don't know yet, but Witt don't make moves without inside help. Never has. Cole set his hat back on his head. Tell the Reverend to be careful. Tell him to watch who he trusts. After Cole disappeared into the darkness, Rosalie sat on the porch, trying to piece together the puzzle. Anonymous letters, land grabs, outlaws with inside information threads in a web she couldn't quite see the shape of. Jonah returned an hour later, his face set in lines of determination. "I've made a decision," he announced. "Tomorrow, I'm going to look at the town records myself. If there's truth to what you've told me, I'll find it." Relief flooded through her. "What changed your mind?" "You did." He sat beside her, taking her hand. "You reminded me why I became a minister, not for safety or comfort, but to serve, to protect the flock, even if it means facing the wolves." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "There's something else. Cole Mercer was here. He says the ransom gang has someone in town feeding them information." Jonah's arm tightened around her. "Then we'd better work fast, before things get worse." That night, sleep came fitfully. Rosalie dreamed of her past, the glitter of the Crystal Palace, the faces of men made foolish by whiskey and loneliness, the weight of coins in her palm. She woke with tears on her cheeks and Jonah's hand gentle on her shoulder. "Bad dream." "Old memories." She wiped her face, embarrassed. "I'm sorry I woke you." "Never apologize for needing comfort." He pulled her close. "Whatever haunts you, Rosalie, it doesn't define you. Not to me, not to God." If only he knew, she thought. If only it were that simple. Wednesday morning brought new urgency. The widow Hutchins appeared at the parsonage door, her face drawn with worry and her youngest child on her hip. "Mrs. Pike, I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know where else to turn." "Come in, Sarah. What's wrong?" Over weak tea, Sarah Hutchins revealed that Asa Crow had visited her personally, offering to buy her land for what seemed like a generous sum. "He said it was Christian charity," Sarah explained, bouncing her fussy baby. "Said he knew times were hard and wanted to help, but when I asked for time to think, he changed, said the offer wouldn't last, said bad things happen to folks who don't know when to take a helping hand." "He threatened you?" "Not in so many words, but I felt it all the same." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "That land's all I have left of my husband, but if staying means putting my children in danger—" Rosalie reached across the table, gripping the other woman's hand. "Don't sign anything yet. Give us a few days. The Reverend and I are looking into some things." After Sarah left, Rosalie stood at the window, watching dust storms gather on the horizon. The anonymous letter had given her a week. 3 days had already passed. Time was running out, and the threads of conspiracy were pulling tighter around Sanctuary Fork. She thought of Jonah at the courthouse, searching records, of May keeping watch from her boarding house, of Cole Mercer, trying to atone for old sins by preventing new ones. They were all pieces on a chessboard, and someone else was moving them toward an endgame she couldn't quite see. The church bell tolled noon, its cracked voice carrying across the valley. Soon, Rosalie knew, that imperfect sound might be the least broken thing in Sanctuary Fork. The smoke appeared at dawn, a black column rising from the eastern hills like a curse made visible. Rosalie spotted it from the kitchen window as she prepared breakfast, the coffee pot frozen in her hand as she watched the dark pillar climb into the cloudless sky. "Fire!" The cry went up from the street, carried by young Tom Brennan as he raced through town on his father's mare. "Fire in the hills, it's heading for the valley." Jonah burst from the bedroom, still pulling on his boots. Through the window, they could see people emerging from houses, their face turned skyward with the universal expression of those who understand that fire and drought make deadly partners. "The Hutchins place," Rosalie breathed. "Sarah's farm is right in that direction." They joined the stream of townspeople heading east, some on horseback, others in wagons loaded with buckets and burlap sacks. Sheriff Hale rode past, his face grim beneath his hat brim. "Need every able body," he called. "Women and children to form a water line from Miller's Well. Men with me to dig fire breaks. The scene at the fire line was controlled chaos. The blaze had started in the bone-dry grassland and was eating its way through sagebrush and tumbleweeds, sending up sparks that threatened to jump the natural barriers and race toward the scattered homesteads. Rosalie found herself beside Maylark, passing buckets that seemed pitifully small against the wall of flame. Her dress was soaked with sweat and well water within minutes, her hands blistering from the rope handles. "Convenient timing," May muttered, never breaking rhythm. Just when folks are being pressured to sell, their land starts burning. Before Rosalie could respond, a scream cut through the roar of fire and shouting. Sarah Hutchins stood at the edge of the bucket line, pointing at her cabin where smoke was beginning to curl from the roof. "My children, they were sleeping." Jonah didn't hesitate. He broke from the line of men digging trenches and ran toward the burning structure, several others following. Rosalie watched, her heart in her throat, as her husband disappeared into the smoke. Time stretched like taffy. The bucket line continued its mechanical rhythm, while everyone's attention fixed on the Hutchins cabin. Then Jonah emerged, a child under each arm, Cole Mercer behind him carrying the baby. Sarah Hutchins fell to her knees, gathering her children close as the cabin's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Everything they owned, gone in minutes. "Thank the Lord," someone murmured, but Rosalie saw the calculation in too many eyes. Another family made desperate, another property that might soon be for sale. The fire fought them for 6 hours, when it was finally contained, leaving a blackened scar across the hills. The exhausted townspeople gathered at the church. Jonah's face was streaked with soot, his voice hoarse from smoke as he organized shelter for the displaced families. "The church is open to anyone who needs refuge," he announced. "What's ours is yours in this time of trial." Asa Crow appeared as if from nowhere, his clothes suspiciously clean for someone who should have been fighting alongside his neighbors. "A generous offer, Reverend," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Though I wonder if it might not be kinder to help these poor souls relocate somewhere safer. I'd be willing to advance funds for travel, perhaps even purchase their land to give them a fresh start." "How thoughtful," Rosalie said, her voice cutting through the murmur of crowd. "And I'm sure your offer has nothing to do with the railroad surveys Maylark spotted last week." The silence that followed was electric. Asa's face went pale, then flushed red. "I don't know what gossip you've been listening to, Mrs. Pike, but it's not gossip when there are documents." Jonah stepped forward, pulling papers from his coat. "I spent yesterday at the courthouse. The Western Development Trust has been buying Creekside land for months. And guess whose name appears on the Trust's incorporation papers? Yours, Deacon Crow." The crowd stirred, voices rising in anger and confusion. Sheriff Hale moved closer, his hand resting on his pistol. "That proves nothing." Asa sputtered, "I'm a businessman. I invest in the future of our community." "By burning people out." The accusation came from Cole Mercer, who stood near the church door. "Because I found something interesting while we were fighting that fire." He held up a metal canister, its side scorched but still recognizable. Coal oil, hidden in a wash near where the fire started, still had oil in it. The crowd's murmur turned to an angry buzz. Asa backed toward the door, but found his way blocked by men who'd lost crops to the flame. "Now hold on," Sheriff Hale commanded, his voice carrying the authority of law. "Nobody's accusing anybody of anything without proof. Cole, bring that can to my office. The rest of you, tend to your families. We'll sort this out proper." As the crowd dispersed, Rosalie noticed Asa corner Jonah near the altar. "You've made a mistake, Reverend," Asa hissed. "I've been patient with you, considering your wife's background. But my patience has limits. As does mine." Jonah replied steadily, "Whatever you think you know about my wife, it doesn't change what you've done to this community." "Doesn't it?" Asa's smile was cold. "Ask her about the Crystal Palace. Ask her about the songs she sang and the men who paid to hear them. Then ask yourself if that's the kind of woman who should be standing in judgment of others. He swept out, leaving Jonah standing frozen by the altar. Rosalie felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crack like the church bell above them. That evening, the parsonage was full of refugees. Sarah Hutchins and her children took the small spare room, while 2 other families bedded down in the parlor. Rosalie moved between them, distributing blankets and what food they had, her movements automatic while her mind churned. She found Jonah on the porch, staring at the stars visible now that the smoke had cleared. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Yes," she sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "We do?" "The Crystal Palace. I've heard the name. A saloon in San Antonio. More than a saloon. A theater of sorts, where men went to drink and gamble and—" She swallowed hard. "And listen to women sing, dance, sometimes. Nothing more than that, despite what people assumed. You were one of those women." "I was 17, alone, hungry." The words came harder than she'd expected. "My father died owing money to the wrong people. They came to collect, and when I couldn't pay, the palace was better than the alternatives they offered." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. "How long?" "2 years, until a traveling preacher came to town. He didn't come to the palace to condemn us. He came to tell us we were loved, that we were worth more than the coins men threw at our feet." She smiled, despite her tears. "I left that night, found work in a boarding house, learned to read properly, tried to become someone new. And then I met a young minister who needed a wife who understood broken people, who wouldn't judge the saloon girls and gamblers when they stumbled into church seeking something better." She looked at him directly. "I never lied to you, Jonah. You never asked about my past, and I was grateful to leave it buried." He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against her cold ones. "I'm not angry about your past, Rosalie. I'm angry that Asa thinks he can use it as a weapon, that he thinks it matters more than the woman you are now." "But it does matter. To the town, to the church board." "Then they'll have to decide what matters more, gossip about yesterday or justice for today." He squeezed her hand. "I meant what I said at our wedding, for better or worse." From inside came the sound of Sarah Hutchins singing softly to her children, a lullaby about green valleys and clear water. The fire had taken her home, but not her hope. "What do we do now?" Rosalie asked. "Now we fight back, properly, legally." Jonah stood, pulling her up with him. "May's been keeping records. I've got documentation from the courthouse. Cole's evidence might prove arson. If Asa wants a battle, he'll have one. He won't fight fair. Neither will we. We'll fight smart, and we'll fight together." Later, as the house settled into exhausted sleep, Rosalie lay awake thinking about the threads connecting everything: the railroad, the fires, the ransom gang, Asa's schemes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had something she hadn't dared hope for: a husband who knew her truth and loved her anyway. The church bell tolled midnight, its cracked voice a reminder that broken things could still serve their purpose. Through the window, she could see the stars wheeling overhead, indifferent to human struggles but constant in their path. In the morning, she knew the real fight would begin. Asa had shown his hand, revealed his cruelty. The anonymous letter had demanded she convince Jonah to support the land sales. Instead, she'd helped expose them. Whatever came next, she'd face it as herself, not the frightened girl from the Crystal Palace, not the perfect preacher's wife, but Rosalie Pike, a woman who'd learned that redemption was not a destination but a daily choice. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the desert sage and the faint scent of coming rain. Change was coming to Sanctuary Fork, one way or another. The only question was whether it would bring renewal or destruction. As sleep finally claimed her, Rosalie's last thought was of the fire line, all those hands passing buckets, working together against a common threat. Perhaps that was the answer. Not individual heroics, but collective action. Not perfect people, but flawed ones choosing to stand together. The cracked bell would ring again come morning, calling the faithful and the doubtful alike, and she would be there, ready for whatever battles the new day might bring. The smoke still clung to everything: clothes, hair, the very walls of the parsonage. Night had fallen hours ago, but sleep wouldn't come. Rosalie sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee long gone cold. Through the thin walls, she could hear Sarah Hutchins humming to her restless children, the melody broken by occasional coughs from smoke-damaged lungs. Jonah stood by the window, a silhouette against the starlight. He hadn't spoken much since their conversation on the porch, and the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "You should rest," she said finally. "Tomorrow will bring its own troubles." "Can't sleep." He turned from the window, and she saw the struggle written on his face. "I keep thinking about what Asa said, about how many others know." "Does it matter?" "Shouldn't it?" He moved to sit across from her, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "I'm supposed to be a moral leader. Rosalie, how can I stand before the congregation when—" "When what? When your wife has a past." The bitterness crept into her voice despite her efforts. "Everyone has a past. Jonah, the only difference is mine can be used as a weapon." "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" She stood, needing to move, to do something with the energy crackling under her skin. "You say you're not angry, but you can barely look at me." "I'm trying to understand." His voice cracked. "For 2 years, you've been everything I thought a minister's wife should be. Now I find out it was all. All what an act a lie." She whirled to face him. "Every kindness I've shown, every prayer I've offered, every night I've lain beside you, was that all false because I once sang songs for lonely men?" "I don't know." The words exploded from him. "I don't know what's real anymore." The honesty of it, raw and painful, struck her like a physical blow. She sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "I am," she said quietly. "I'm real. The woman who loves you, who tends the sick, who fights for justice, that's real. The girl in San Antonio, she was real too. Both are me." Jonah buried his face in his hands. "I'm a hypocrite. I preach forgiveness and redemption. But when it comes to my own wife, you're human." She reached across the table, not quite touching him. "And you're hurt. I should have told you before we married." "Would I have married you if you had?" The question hung between them, unanswered because they both knew the truth. The young minister he'd been, fresh from seminary and full of certainty, would have walked away. "I need time," he said finally, "to think, to pray." "And I need air." She stood, grabbing her shawl. "I'll check on May, see if she needs help with the injured." Outside, the night was cooler than usual, the fire having broken the heat's grip temporarily. Her feet carried her not to May's boarding house, but to the church, its door standing open to accommodate the overflow of refugees. Inside, a single lamp burned near the altar. She wasn't surprised to find Cole Mercer there, sitting in a back pew with his hat beside him. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, sliding into the pew across the aisle. "Hard to sleep when you're waiting for the other shoe to drop." He glanced at her. "Heard Asa making threats earlier. He knows about my past, plans to use it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "We all got things we'd rather stay buried. Question is, what matters more, who we were or who we're trying to be?" "Easy for you to say. Nobody expects a former bounty hunter to be perfect. A minister's wife, though. You think perfection's what folks need?" He shook his head. "I've known plenty of perfect people. Most of them were too busy polishing their halos to see when their neighbors were hurting." Through the windows, she could see lights moving in the darkness, townspeople still dealing with the fire's aftermath. "Jonah's struggling," she admitted. "Can't blame him. Man's got to work through his own mind. But if he's got any sense, he'll realize what he's got." Cole stood, settling his hat. You fought that fire today same as anyone. Tended the burned. Sheltered the homeless. That's who you are now. Rest is just history. After he left, Rosalie sat alone in the sanctuary. The cracked bell above seemed to watch over her, its imperfection a reminder that broken things could still serve. She thought about the girl she'd been, desperate and alone, and the woman she'd become. Were they really so different? Both had done what they needed to survive. Both had chosen hope when despair would have been easier. She heard footsteps and looked up to find Jonah in the doorway. He'd thrown on his coat but hadn't buttoned it, and his hair stood at angles from running his hands through it. "I went to find you at May's," he said. "She said to try here." Couldn't face her questions tonight. He moved down the aisle, stopping a few feet away. "I'm sorry for how I reacted, for making this about my feelings when you're the one being threatened. You have a right to your feelings, and you have a right to compassion, to the same grace I'd show any soul seeking redemption." He sat beside her, close but not touching. "I've been thinking about the woman at the well, how Jesus knew her past, all of it, and offered her living water anyway. I'm not asking for your ministry, Jonah. I'm asking for your love. They're supposed to be the same thing." His voice was thick with unshed tears. "That's what I realized, sitting alone in our empty room. My love shouldn't come with conditions. It shouldn't depend on you being who I thought you were instead of who you are." She felt her own tears rising. "I never meant to deceive you. I wanted so badly to be the woman you saw when you looked at me. Clean, good, worthy. You are worthy. You were worthy in San Antonio, and you're worthy now." He turned to face her fully. "I'm the one who needs forgiveness. For my pride, for thinking your past could diminish what we have." "There's nothing to forgive." "Yes, there is." He caught her hands in his. The preacher's wife wouldn't confess. The familiar words from the threatening letter made her freeze. "Because confession implies shame, and you have nothing to be ashamed of." His grip tightened. So she held him tight and said, "Forgive me this way." The words hung in the air, transformed from threat to invitation. Rosalie felt something break inside her, a wall she'd built so carefully she'd forgotten it was there. She moved into his arms, burying her face against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of smoke and soap and him. "Forgive me this way," she whispered. "For the secrets, for the fear, for not trusting you with all of me." His arms tightened around her. "Already forgiven, already loved, always." They knelt together on the hard wooden floor, his forehead pressed to hers, their tears mingling in the lamplight, with the smell of smoke still heavy in the air. They prayed not formal words, but the wordless communication of two hearts trying to find their way back to each other. "I was so scared," she admitted when they finally pulled apart. "Not of Asa or his threats, but of losing you, of seeing disgust in your eyes." "Never." He cupped her face in his hands. "I may be a fool sometimes, prideful and stubborn, but I'm not fool enough to turn away from the best thing in my life." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, a promise renewed. When they broke apart, she saw movement near the door May Lark, pretending she hadn't been watching. "Church is full up," May announced, as if they'd asked. "Got family sleeping in the aisles. Tomorrow's going to be complicated." "Then we'd better be ready," Jonah said, helping Rosalie to her feet. "All of us, together." They walked home through streets lit by stars and the occasional lantern in a window. The parsonage was quiet now. The refugees finally succumbed to exhausted sleep, in their own room. They moved with the comfortable familiarity of married couples, preparing for bed while navigating the small space. "Asa won't stop," Rosalie said as she brushed out her hair. "He'll spread the story, try to turn the town against us. Then we'll face it with truth." Jonah sat on the bed's edge, pulling off his boots. "No more secrets between us, no more shame, If the town can't accept that people change, that grace is real, then maybe I'm preaching to the wrong congregation. She set down her brush, moving to sit beside him. You'd leave, give up everything you've built here. I'd rather lose a church than lose you. He took her hand, threading their fingers together. Besides, I don't think it'll come to that. This town's full of people carrying secrets, nursing old wounds. Maybe what they need is to see that redemption isn't just for Sunday sermons. Later, lying in their narrow bed, Rosalie listened to her husband's breathing slow into sleep. His arm was heavy across her waist, anchoring her to the present. Through the window, she could see the first hints of dawn painting the eastern sky. A new day, bringing new battles but also new possibilities. She thought of the girl in San Antonio, singing for coins and dreaming of escape. That girl could never have imagined this, a husband who knew her fully and loved her still. A community worth fighting for, a life built on something more solid than pretense. The preacher's wife wouldn't confess, because she had nothing to confess. She'd already paid for her past with years of fear and hiding. Now, held tight in forgiveness and love, she could finally let that frightened girl rest. Tomorrow would bring Asa's accusations, the town's judgment, the fight for justice. But tonight, in this moment between darkness and dawn, she had everything that mattered. A husband's arms around her, a purpose worth pursuing, and the knowledge that grace, real grace, was stronger than any shame. The cracked bell would ring with morning, calling the faithful to another day, and she would answer that call, not as someone pretending to be worthy, but as someone who'd learned that worthiness wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, broken but brave, ready to love and be loved in return. The morning after the fire, Jonah stood before what remained of his congregation and spoke truth, not about Rosalie's past that was not his story to tell, but about the corruption eating at Sanctuary Fork's heart like a disease. The Western Development Trust seeks to steal what little our poorest families have, he declared from the pulpit, his voice carrying over the packed church. They burn out the desperate, then offer to buy their misery for pennies on the dollar. This is not God's work. This is greed masquerading as charity. Asa Crow sat in his usual place, front pew, left side, his face a mask of righteous indignation. But Jonah noticed how his supporters seemed fewer today, how some avoided his gaze. After the service, the real work began. Rosalie organized teams to dig for water in the barren stretch behind the cemetery, where Cole Mercer claimed to have seen signs of an underground stream during his bounty hunting days. Learn to read the land when tracking men, Cole explained, pointing to a slight depression where scraggly plants grew greener than their neighbors. Water finds its way, even through rock. Just gotta know where to look. May Lark arrived with a crew of the town's older women, all carrying shovels and determination. Figured if we're going to fight a drought and land thieves, might as well start with something practical. They dug in shifts through the morning heat. Rosalie's hands, already blistered from the fire buckets, screamed protest with each shovelful of dirt, but she kept digging, aware of the townspeople watching, weighing her actions against whatever gossip Asa had begun spreading. "Are you sure about this spot?" asked Ben Miller, the blacksmith, pausing to wipe his brow. "Sure as I can be," Cole replied. "Though if I'm wrong, we'll have a nice hole for burying our hopes in." It was young Tom Brennan who hit moisture first, his shout bringing everyone running. The water seeped slowly at first, muddy and reluctant, but it was there, life beneath the scorched earth. "We'll need to shore it up proper," Ben said, already calculating. "Line it with stones, build a winch system, but by God, we've got water." The mood shifted, hope crackling through the crowd like lightning. If they could find water in a drought, what else might be possible? That evening, Jonah addressed a town meeting in the church, the building still crowded with fire refugees. He'd posted the documents from the courthouse on the wall: land transfers, trust certificates, survey maps. "The railroad is coming," he announced. Not might come, not could come is coming. The surveys are complete. The route runs right along our dried creek bed, through the lands they're trying to steal. Sheriff Hale stood near the door, his weathered face unreadable. That's a heavy accusation. Reverend, you're saying Asa Crow knew about this. I'm saying his name is on these documents. Draw your own conclusions. Asa rose from his seat, his voice dripping contempt. I've served this community for 15 years. I've helped build this church, supported this town through good times and bad. And now you'd believe the word of a minister whose own wife... Careful, Deacon. Cole Mercer's voice cut through the room like a blade. Man should be sure of his ground before he starts slinging mud. Are you threatening me? Stating facts, like the fact that I've been watching your meetings with those railroad men, or the fact that the coal oil can from the fire has your store's mark on it. The room erupted in voices. Sheriff Hale raised his hand for quiet. Enough, Cole. You bring that evidence to my office tomorrow. Asa, you'll answer these questions proper, and everyone else, go home. We'll handle this by law, not by mob. As the crowd dispersed, Rosalie noticed a stranger near the back, a woman in traveling clothes, her face weather-worn but alert. She caught Rosalie's eye and nodded slightly before disappearing into the night. The next morning brought two surprises. First, the well they dug had filled overnight, clear water rising to within feet of the surface. Second, Asa's store stood empty, a hastily scrawled sign reading, "Closed for business." He ran, May announced, bursting into the parsonage kitchen, lit out before dawn with 2 carpet bags and a guilty conscience. But Rosalie felt no relief. He wouldn't run without a plan. This isn't over. Her instincts proved right. That afternoon, a rider arrived with a telegram. The church's regional board was sending an investigator to look into irregularities in Sanctuary Forks ministry. The wire was signed by 3 board members, all known associates of Asa Crow. They're going to use my past, Rosalie said quietly, reading over Jonah's shoulder. Question your fitness to lead because of who you married. Then we'll face that too. Jonah's jaw set with determination. But first, we protect this town. The next days blurred together in a haze of activity. The new well became a gathering point, families coming to draw water and share news. Rosalie and May documented every suspicious land transfer, building a case that even a corrupt investigator couldn't ignore. Then came the morning Cole rode in fast, his horse lathered with sweat. Riders coming, he announced. 12 men, maybe more, moving like they've got purpose. Sheriff Hale checked his weapons. Ransom's gang. Could be, or could be Asa's railroad friends. Come to finish what the fire started. Cole dismounted, his hand resting on his gun. Either way, they're not coming for coffee and prayer. Jonah gathered the able-bodied men in the church. We're not gunfighters, but we are this town's protectors. We stand together, or we fall separately. They had perhaps an hour to prepare. Women and children were moved to the most defensible buildings. Men took positions at windows and doorways. The new well was covered with planks to protect their water source. Rosalie found herself in the church with a rifle she barely knew how to use, watching the road beside May. Strange how it comes down to this, May mused. All the paperwork and preaching. And in the end, it's still about who's willing to fight for what they believe in. The riders appeared as dust clouds first, then resolved into men hard-faced and armed. But they stopped outside town. One rider continuing alone, not Whit Ransom, but a man in a city suit, looking uncomfortable on horseback. I'm looking for Deacon Asa Crow. He called out, I represent the Western Development Trust. We had an arrangement. Sheriff Hale stepped into the street. Asa's gone, and any arrangement he made isn't worth the paper it's written on. This town's not for sale. The man's face flushed. You can't stop progress. The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Maybe so. Jonah appeared beside the sheriff. But it'll pay fair price for right-of-way, not steal it through arson and intimidation. You're that preacher. Crow warned us about you." The man's smile was unpleasant. "Said you had a weakness. Something about your wife's colorful history." Rosalie felt her stomach clench. But before anyone could respond, the stranger woman from the town meeting stepped forward. She'd been so quiet. Most hadn't noticed her arrival. "Actually," the woman said, producing a badge, "I'm more interested in Mr. Crow's colorful present. Mary Sullivan, Pinkerton Agency. The railroad hired me to investigate irregularities in their land acquisitions." The city man's face went white. "You're not one of our agents?" "No, I work for the honest part of your company, the part that doesn't appreciate managers making private deals to cheat settlers." She turned to Sheriff Hale. "I've got warrants for Asa Crow and several others. Seems their scheme went deeper than anyone knew." The confrontation deflated like a punctured balloon. The hired guns, seeing no profit in fighting for men who'd be arrested anyway, melted away. The city man was taken into custody, sputtering about lawyers and connections. That evening, the town gathered at the well. What had started as desperation had become celebration. Water flowed clear and cold, a miracle in the drought. "We're not out of the woods," Jonah warned. "The church investigation is still coming. The railroad issue isn't fully resolved, and Asa's still out there somewhere. But we're together," Sarah Hutchins said, her children playing at her feet. "And we've got water. Rest we can face as it comes." Rosalie stood beside her husband, watching their neighbors share water and hope. The stranger woman, Agent Sullivan, approached with a slight smile. "Interesting town you have here," she said. "Preacher who fights for justice, former bounty hunter standing with the law. And you, Mrs. Pike." She lowered her voice. "Asa Crow mentioned the Crystal Palace in his letters to the railroad men. Thought it gave him leverage." Rosalie felt Jonah's hand find hers. And I've been to San Antonio. Heard about a young woman who sang there, who left one night to follow a better path." Sullivan's eyes were kind. "Takes courage to change your life like that. Even more courage to stay changed when the past comes calling." She tipped her hat and moved away, leaving Rosalie breathless with relief and something else recognition. For the first time, someone from outside had heard her story and seen not shame, but strength. The church bell rang, still cracked, but somehow steadier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, they had water, community, and truth. The preacher's wife hadn't needed to confess or hide. She'd stood in the light, past and present visible, and found herself accepted not despite her history, but because of who it had helped her become. The stars came out one by one, reflected in the water drawn from desert ground. Miracles, Rosalie thought, came in many forms. Sometimes it was water from dry earth. Sometimes it was justice from unexpected sources. And sometimes it was the simple grace of being known and loved anyway. Sunday arrived with an ominous stillness. The morning sky hung low and gray, unusual for September, and the air felt thick as molasses. Even the birds seemed subdued, their usual dawn chorus reduced to scattered, uncertain calls. Rosalie dressed carefully for church, her hands steady despite the knowledge of what was coming. The regional church board's investigator had arrived the night before, a thin man named Reverend Morse, with eyes like chips of flint and a mouth that seemed permanently pursed in disapproval. "Ready?" Jonah asked, adjusting his collar. Dark circles shadowed his eyes from a sleepless night. As ready as one can be for their own trial. She smoothed her plain gray dress, the same one she'd worn the day the first letter arrived. It seemed fitting somehow. Coming full circle, the church was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread that Asa Crow had returned in the night, slipping in like a snake to whisper poison in Reverend Morse's ear. He sat in his usual pew now, his satisfied smile making Rosalie's skin crawl. May Lark caught her arm as they entered. "Whatever happens, remember this whole town saw you fighting that fire, digging that well. That's worth more than any words Asa can speak." Reverend Morse had transformed the sanctuary into a courtroom. He sat behind a table at the altar. Church board documents spread before him like weapons. Sheriff Hale stood near the door, his presence a reminder that this was church business, not legal yet. "We gather today," Morse intoned, his voice thin and reedy, "to examine serious allegations against this ministry, questions of moral fitness, proper conduct, and," his eyes found Rosalie, "the suitability of certain persons to represent our faith." Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows. Dust swirled in small devils across the street. "I called Deacon Asa Crow to speak." Asa rose with theatrical dignity. "It pains me to bring this before the church, but conscience demands truth. Our minister's wife, Mrs. Pike, has deceived this community. She was not always the respectable woman she pretends to be." "I pretend nothing," Rosalie said. Standing, Jonah reached for her hand, but she stepped forward. "Yes, I worked at the Crystal Palace in San Antonio. Yes, I sang for money when I was desperate and alone. And yes, I left that life behind when I found faith." Gasps rippled through the congregation, but she continued. "What Deacon Crow hasn't told you is why he's really here. Show them the documents." May came forward with the ledger, laying it open before Reverend Morse. "Land transfers, shell companies, proof that Asa Crow has been stealing from the poor families of this town." "This is not relevant," Morse began, but Sheriff Hale interrupted. "Actually, it is. See, we found something interesting when Agent Sullivan arrested those railroad men." He produced a letter. "Correspondence between Asa and the Western Development Trust includes a very interesting paragraph about silencing the meddling preacher and his tart wife. The wind outside grew stronger. Through the windows, Rosalie could see a wall of dust approaching from the east, a full sandstorm bearing down on Sanctuary Fork. "Storm coming!" someone shouted. "Big one!" As if the warning had broken a spell, chaos erupted. Half the congregation rushed for the doors to secure their homes. Others pressed closer, determined to see justice done. In the confusion, Rosalie noticed movement in the shadows near the altar. "Gun!" Cole Mercer's shout cut through the noise. Whit Ransom stepped from behind the altar screen, pistol trained on the crowd. Two more outlaws emerged from the vestry. They must have hidden there during the night, waiting. "Nobody move," Ransom drawled. "Asa here owes us for services rendered, and we aim to collect." "You fool," Asa sputtered. "Not now." "Now's perfect. Storm will cover our tracks. That strongbox in your store should cover what you owe us, plus interest for our trouble." The sanctuary had become a trap. Families huddled together as the outlaws spread out, weapons drawn. Outside, the storm hit with full force, turning the windows opaque with driven sand. "You've made a mistake," Sheriff Hale said calmly, hand hovering near his holstered gun. "Let these people go. Your quarrel's with Crow, not them. Our quarrel's with whoever stands between us and payment." Ransom's smile was cold. "Starting with you, Sheriff." The standoff stretched taut as telegraph wire. Then several things happened at once. Young Tom Brennan, hidden beneath a pew, kicked over a lamp. The crash drew eyes and guns toward him. His mother screamed. Cole Mercer moved, fast as thought, shoving the boy down as bullets splintered wood above their heads. In that instant of distraction, Jonah grabbed a heavy candlestick and swung it at the nearest outlaw. Sheriff Hale drew and fired. Women grabbed children and dove for cover as the sanctuary erupted in violence. Rosalie found herself pressed against a pew, May beside her. Through the chaos, she saw Asa crawling toward the side door and felt rage bloom hot in her chest. He'd brought this violence into their sacred space, endangered their children, all for greed. She moved without thinking, intercepting him at the door. He shoved her aside roughly, but she grabbed his coat, using his momentum to send him sprawling. They wrestled briefly. her singer's strength surprising him. Until May arrived with a hymnal and ended the struggle with a well-placed blow to his head. The gunfight was brief but vicious. When the smoke cleared, one outlaw lay dead, another wounded. Ransom himself was on the ground, Cole standing over him with a smoking pistol. "Told you I'd changed my ways," Cole said quietly. "But some skills don't forget." Sheriff Hale was bleeding from a graze on his arm, but still standing. More importantly, none of the townspeople had been seriously hurt, though several sported cuts and bruises from diving for cover. Outside, the storm raged like God's own fury. Sand beat against the walls, seeking entry through every crack. The air inside turned thick and brown despite closed windows and doors. Reverend Morse stood frozen at his table, his careful documents scattered and torn. This is not, I didn't." "No," Jonas said, helping Rosalie to her feet. You came here to judge my wife for her past while ignoring the crimes happening under your nose. You were so focused on respectability that you couldn't see the real sins: greed, theft, violence against the innocent." He moved to the pulpit, standing tall despite the chaos around him. Blood from a cut on his cheek made him look like an Old Testament prophet. "Let me tell you about my wife. Yes, she sang in a saloon. She survived when the world gave her no good choices. And when she found faith, she didn't just claim it, she lived it." His voice rose over the storm. "She's nursed your sick, taught your children, fought fires to save your homes. She's shown more Christian love in 3 years than some show in a lifetime. If that's not suitable for the church, then maybe it's the church that needs changing." "Amen," Sarah Hutchins called out, clutching her children. "Amen," echoed Ben Miller. And others took up the cry until it filled the sanctuary. Asa stirred, groaning, but Sheriff Hale was already there with shackles. "Asa Crow, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and about a dozen other things I'll sort out when this storm passes." The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the building on its foundation. But inside, something had shifted. The congregation pressed close. Not in judgment, but in protection. These people had seen Rosalie's true character tested by fire, literal and figurative, and found it strong. Reverend Morse gathered his scattered papers with shaking hands. I need to reconsider. This is not what I expected." "Evil rarely is," May said tartly. "It comes dressed in respectability, speaking of propriety while picking your pocket. Maybe next time you'll look deeper than surface scandals." Hours passed before the storm began to ease. When they finally emerged from the church, Sanctuary Fork looked like a different place. Sand drifts reached halfway up some buildings. The new well's cover had held, protecting their water. And despite everything, the cracked bell still hung in its tower. Sheriff Hale led his prisoners away, Asa and the surviving outlaws destined for territorial prison. Agent Sullivan, who'd weathered the storm in the hotel, promised to ensure the railroad dealt fairly with the town now that their corrupt agents were exposed. That evening, as the town worked together to dig out from the storm, Reverend Morse approached Jonah and Rosalie where they helped clear sand from the Hutchins' temporary shelter. "I owe you both an apology," he said stiffly. "I came here with preconceptions, ready to judge based on hearsay rather than evidence of character." "We all make mistakes," Jonah replied. "Question is what we do after we recognize them." Morse nodded slowly. "I'll be recommending to the board that your ministry here continue, with commendation for unusual circumstances handled with grace." After he left, Rosalie leaned against her husband, exhausted but oddly at peace. "Think that's the end of it?" "The end of Asa's schemes. Maybe, but there'll be other challenges." He wrapped an arm around her. "Difference is, now everyone knows who we really are. No more secrets to be used against us." The cracked bell tolled the hour, its imperfect voice carrying over the sand-scrubbed town. Tomorrow would bring the work of rebuilding, of helping the railroad negotiations, of healing the wounds left by violence and betrayal. But tonight, as stars appeared in the storm-washed sky. Rosalie felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete acceptance. She was known, all of her, past and present, and still belonged. "Come on," May called, brandishing a shovel. "This sand won't move itself, and my back's already complaining." They worked until full dark, the whole town laboring together. Former sins and current saints, all covered in the same dust, all cleaning up the same mess, all building the same future. The preacher's wife had finally confessed, not in shame, but in defiance of those who would use shame as a weapon. And in that confession, she'd found not judgment, but community. Not rejection, but deeper acceptance than she'd ever dared hope for. The morning after the storm dawned clear and still, as if nature itself had exhausted its fury. Sheriff Hale stood in his office, studying the evidence they'd gathered from Asa Crow's abandoned store. Maylark, Jonah, Rosalie, and Cole Mercer crowded around his desk, examining ledgers and documents that told a story of systematic theft. "Look at this," May pointed to an entry. "Martha Wilkins, widow with 5 children, signed with an X because she can't read. Asa told her she was selling 2 acres of scrubland. The deed actually transferred 30 acres, including her water rights. And here," Rosalie added, unfolding a map, "the railroad route. See how it curves to avoid the rocky sections? Every piece of land Asa targeted sits right along the planned track." Sheriff Hale rubbed his jaw. "We'll need more than this for the territorial court. Need witnesses willing to testify." "They'll testify," Jonah said firmly, "now that Asa can't threaten them anymore." Cole had been quiet, studying a particular document. Now he looked up, his face grim. "Found something else. List of names people who refused to sell. Look at the marks beside some of them." They leaned closer. Next to several names were small crosses. Sarah Hutchins was there, her name marked just days before the fire that destroyed her home. "He was planning more fires," Rosalie breathed. "More accidents to force sales." "There's enough here to hang him," Sheriff Hale said quietly. "If not literally, then legally. Question is, can we find where he hid the money? These families deserve compensation." "I might know." Cole said, "When I rode with Ransom years back, Asa was already dirty, had a reputation for hiding his gains. Always talked about how banks couldn't be trusted." "So where would a man like that hide his stolen wealth?" May wondered. They spent the morning searching Asa's store, finding nothing but legitimate inventory and dusty shelves. It was young Tom Brennan, recruited to help clean up, who made the discovery. "Mrs. Pike," he called from the storeroom, "the floor sounds funny here." Sure enough, beneath a strategically placed barrel of flour, loose floorboards concealed a cavity. Inside were canvas bags heavy with gold coins, paper currency, and bonds of fortune built on others' misery. "Mary and Joseph," May whispered. "There's enough here to compensate everyone he cheated and then some." Sheriff Hale took custody of the money, promising to work with Agent Sullivan to ensure fair distribution. Word spread quickly through town, bringing a mix of relief and anger as people realized the extent of Asa's betrayal. That afternoon, they gathered at the courthouse for a formal hearing. The territorial judge, summoned by telegraph, was a stern woman named Helen Morrison, who'd earned a reputation for fair dealing in a man's world. One by one, the victims testified. Martha Wilkins, clutching her youngest child, explained how Asa had come to her the day after her husband's funeral, offering Christian charity in her time of need. Old Pete Campbell, whose rheumatism made holding a pen painful, described signing with an X while Asa read aloud, lying about what the document contained. Asa sat shackled between 2 deputies, his fine clothes replaced by prison gray. His attempts at defiance had crumbled as evidence mounted. When Whit Ransom testified hoping for leniency about their arrangement, Asa's shoulders slumped in final defeat. The court finds sufficient evidence for trial on multiple counts of fraud. conspiracy, and attempted murder. Judge Morrison declared, "Furthermore, I'm ordering immediate restitution to all affected families from the recovered funds." Cheers erupted from the gallery. Justice, so long delayed, tasted sweet as spring water. But the day's revelations weren't finished. Agent Sullivan approached Jonah and Rosalie as they left the courthouse. "There's something else you should know," she said, producing a telegram. "I've been in contact with the railroad's main office. They're horrified by what their agents did here. They want to make amends." "How?" Jonah asked warily. "Fair payment for right-of-way, for starters. But also," she smiled, "they want to establish a water station here. Sanctuary Fork would become a regular stop, bringing commerce and growth, legitimate growth, not stolen." The implications were staggering. A railroad stop meant jobs, visitors, a future beyond mere survival. Rosalie saw the same hope reflected in her neighbors' faces. That evening, Cole found her at the well, drawing water for the celebration May was organizing. "Wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "You and the Reverend could have turned your backs when you learned about my past. Instead, you stood by me." "We all deserve second chances," Rosalie replied. "That's what this place is supposed to be about, sanctuary." Cole nodded, then surprised her by adding, "Got a letter yesterday? My mother's still alive, living with my sister in Missouri. They want to see me." "That's wonderful. Cole, been thinking about going, making peace with old ghosts." He glanced at her. "Seeing you face down your past with such courage made me think maybe I could too." As stars appeared overhead, the town gathered in the church. Not for judgment this time, but for gratitude. Jonah led prayers of thanksgiving while May and her crew served a feast cobbled together from everyone's contributions. Reverend Morse had delayed his departure to attend. He stood awkwardly near the door until Rosalie approached him. "No hard feelings," she said, offering her hand. "You were doing what you thought was right." "I was doing what was easy," he corrected, shaking her hand. "Looking for scandal instead of substance. You've taught me something valuable about rushing to judgment." Sheriff Hale climbed onto a makeshift platform, raising his hand for attention. "Folks, we've got some decisions to make. With the railroad coming and restitution being paid, this town's going to change. We need to decide how." What followed was democracy in its purest form. Suggestions flew: a proper school, a medical clinic, improved roads. Sarah Hutchins, no longer in danger of losing her land, proposed a communal grazing area for small farmers. Ben Miller wanted to expand his smithy to handle railroad repairs. "What about the church bell?" someone called out. "Been cracked longer than most of us remember." Jonah stood, his voice carrying easily through the crowd. "I've been thinking about that bell. Yes, it's cracked. Yes, it rings imperfect. But it's our bell. It's rung for our joys and sorrows, called us together in good times and bad." Rosalie saw where he was going and smiled. "Maybe we keep it," she suggested, as a reminder that broken things can still serve a purpose, that imperfection doesn't mean worthless. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The cracked bell had become a symbol of their community, flawed but functional, damaged but determined. Later, as the celebration wound down, Rosalie found herself standing with May outside the church. The older woman puffed her pipe contentedly, watching couples dance to fiddle music. "Never thought I'd see the day," May mused. "Asa Crow in chains. Justice served. And you standing tall with the whole town knowing your story." "It doesn't feel real yet," Rosalie admitted. "I keep waiting for someone to remember they're supposed to be scandalized. Oh, some will clutch their pearls when the excitement dies down. Human nature." May blew a smoke ring. "But most folks have more sense than that. They've seen who you really are. That matters more than who you were." Jonah appeared, slightly disheveled from dancing with the Wilkins children. May's organizing a barn raising for the Hutchins family next week. Thinks Sarah's earned a proper house. Count me in, Rosalie said, though I'm better with a hammer than a saw. As they walked home through streets still showing traces of storm sand, Rosalie reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The anonymous letter that had started it all seemed like something from another lifetime. The fear that had driven her for so long had dissolved, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: belonging. "Penny for your thoughts," Jonah said, taking her hand. "Just thinking about truth, how we run from it, hide it, dress it up in fine clothes. But in the end, it always finds a way to surface. Like water in the desert." "Exactly like that." She squeezed his hand. Asa thought he could bury the truth under legal documents and threats. Instead, he buried himself. They paused at their door, looking back at the town they'd fought to protect. Lamplight glowed in windows, and the sound of laughter drifted on the night air. The railroad would bring changes, challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, Sanctuary Fork felt worthy of its name, a place of refuge for the broken, the searching, the imperfect. "No regrets?" Jonah asked softly. "None," Rosalie answered, and meant it. The girl who sang in San Antonio, the woman who stands here now, they're both me. I'm not ashamed of either anymore. Inside their small home, they prepared for bed with the comfortable rhythm of a couple who'd weathered storms together. Tomorrow would bring the work of rebuilding, redistributing, planning for a future suddenly bright with possibility. But tonight, they had this truth spoken and accepted, justice served, a community united not by perfection but by shared humanity. The cracked bell would ring come morning, calling them to another day of work and worship. Its imperfect voice a reminder that grace often comes disguised as damage, and that sometimes the most beautiful songs come from instruments that have known breaking. The rains came 3 weeks after Asa Crow's trial, breaking the drought with a gentle persistence that turned the desert green almost overnight. Rosalie stood on the church steps, watching water run in rivulets down the street, carrying away months of accumulated dust and despair. "Never thought I'd be so happy to see mud," May Lark said, joining her under the eaves, "though my boarders are tracking it everywhere." "Small price for answered prayers," Rosalie replied, holding out her hand to catch the drops. The transformation of Sanctuary Fork had begun even before the rains. With the restitution money distributed and railroad contracts signed fairly, families who'd been on the edge of leaving were now building additions to their homes. The sound of hammers and saws competed with the rainfall's rhythm. "Letter came for you," May said, producing an envelope from her apron. "From San Antonio." Rosalie's hand trembled slightly as she took it. She'd written to the church that had helped her leave the Crystal Palace, telling them of her life now, of the ministry she and Jonah shared. Opening it, she found warm words of congratulation and something else, a photograph of young women in simple dresses standing before a newly built shelter. "The Magdalene Home," she read aloud. "A refuge for women seeking to leave the saloon life, founded with donations from former residents who found new paths." Tears mixed with rain on her cheeks. "They named it after me, not my name specifically, but they remember." May squeezed her shoulder. "Seeds you planted bearing fruit. That's how grace works forward and backward through time." That afternoon, the whole town gathered for Sarah Hutchins's barn raising. Despite the rain, spirits were high. Men worked on the frame while women prepared food under canvas shelters. Children ran between the workers, carrying nails and messages, their laughter bright as new coins. Cole Mercer worked alongside Ben Miller, their easy cooperation a far cry from the suspicion of months past. He'd delayed his trip east to help with the building, but Rosalie could see the anticipation in his eyes. A man preparing to face his past and make peace with it. Looking good." Sheriff Hale called up to the workers. His arm had healed clean from the church shooting, and he wore his star with renewed pride. The capture of the ransom gang had brought commendations from the territorial capital and talk of expansion, perhaps a deputy or two as the town grew. Jonah moved among the workers, less with hammer than with encouragement. He'd grown into his role these past weeks, no longer the uncertain young minister trying to please everyone, but a man who understood that leadership sometimes meant taking stands that made you unpopular. And Mrs. Pike. Young Tom Brennan ran up, soaked but grinning. Ma says to tell you the teaching supplies arrived on yesterday's freight. Books and slates and everything. The new school was Rosalie's project, funded by railroad compensation and community donations. She'd volunteered to teach reading and writing to the women who, like Martha Wilkins, had never learned. No more signing with X's. No more depending on others to interpret documents. Tell your mother we'll start Monday. Rosalie said, rain or shine. As evening approached, the barn stood complete, raw wood gleaming wet in the lamplight. Sarah Hutchins walked through the structure with wondering eyes, her children racing between the stalls that would soon hold livestock bought with restitution funds. I never thought, Sarah's voice caught. After James died, I thought we'd lose everything. Now look at us. You never gave up, Rosalie reminded her. Even when Asa threatened, you held on. This is just the world catching up to your courage. The celebration that night filled the new barn with music and warmth. Someone had brought a fiddle, another a guitar, and soon couples were dancing on the packed earth floor. Rosalie watched from the side, contentment filling her like wine. May I have this dance? Jonah appeared at her elbow, hand extended formally. In front of everyone, she teased. What will people think of the minister dancing? They'll think he loves his wife, he said simply, leading her onto the floor. They moved together easily. 3 years of marriage teaching them each other's rhythms. Around them, their neighbors danced former enemies, now partners. Secrets revealed, now healing into acceptance. Look at us, Jonah murmured. A year ago, we were barely surviving. Now we're living, Rosalie finished. Actually living, not just existing. The music slowed, and other couples joined them. Sheriff Hale led May Lark onto the floor, causing whispers and smiles. The two had been circling each other for months, testing the waters of late-life romance. About time, Rosalie whispered to Jonah. May won't give up her independence easily. Neither will he. Maybe that's why it works. As the evening wound down, Cole Mercer approached them. I'll be leaving in the morning, he said quietly. Wanted to thank you both before I go. How long will you be gone? Jonah asked. Don't know. Long as it takes to make things right, I suppose. Cole shifted his weight, uncomfortable with sentiment. You showed me a man can change, that the past doesn't have to be chains. I owe you for that. You owe us nothing, Rosalie said firmly. Just right when you get there, let us know you're well. He nodded, touched his hat, and melted back into the crowd. Tomorrow he'd ride east toward a reunion years in the making. But tonight he was part of their community, their family of choice. The rains continued through the night, steady and nourishing. By morning, the creek that had been dry so long showed a trickle of water, promise of flow to come. The townspeople emerged to a world washed clean, puddles reflecting sky like scattered mirrors. At the church, they discovered a gift. Someone no one would ever claim credit had climbed the tower in the night and cleaned the cracked bell, polishing away years of grime. It still bore its imperfection, that distinctive crack that changed its voice. But now it gleamed in the morning sun. Beautiful, Rosalie breathed, standing beside Jonah as he prepared to ring it for Sunday service. Beautiful because it's honest, he replied. No pretense, no hiding, just what it is broken but still singing. The bell rang out across Sanctuary Fork, its unique voice calling the faithful to worship. They came in numbers that required opening the doors despite the cool morning ranchers and farmers, shopkeepers and laborers, Women who'd signed their names with X's and were learning to write them properly. Jonah's sermon that morning was simple. He spoke of rain after drought, of justice after oppression, of how God often worked through the most unlikely people, former saloon singers and reformed gunmen, sharp-tongued boarding house owners and widows who wouldn't give up. "We are none of us perfect," he concluded. "We are all of us cracked bells, bearing damage from our past, but we ring nonetheless. We call to each other across the valleys of loneliness and fear, and together, our imperfect voices make a chorus that can shake the foundations of injustice." After service, the congregation lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of community. Plans were made for the school opening, for a harvest celebration, for the arrival of the first official train stop in 3 months. The future that had once seemed so uncertain now bloomed with possibility. Agent Sullivan, who'd extended her stay to ensure smooth railroad negotiations, approached Rosalie at the church door. "I'll be leaving soon," she said. "My work here is done, and there are other towns that need investigating. But I wanted you to know I've recommended Sanctuary Fork as a model for fair dealing. Your story, Mrs. Pike, of redemption and courage. It's part of my report." "I don't know what to say," Rosalie managed. "Say you'll keep being yourself. This town needs you, not the perfect preacher's wife you tried to be, but the real woman who fought for justice." Sullivan smiled. "The West is changing. We need people like you to help it change right." As afternoon faded to evening, Jonah and Rosalie walked to the new well, now properly lined with stone and equipped with a windmill pump. Water flowed clear and constant, fed by underground springs that had always been there, waiting to be found. "Remember that first anonymous letter?" Rosalie asked, trailing her fingers in the water trough. "Trying to use shame to control us. Seems like a lifetime ago." "In a way, I'm grateful for it. Without that threat, we might have gone on hiding, pretending, living half a life." She cupped water in her hands, watched it run through her fingers like liquid silver. "The truth really does set you free. Even when it comes at a cost." Jonah agreed. "Especially then." They stood together as the sun set over Sanctuary Fork, painting the rain-washed buildings in shades of gold and rose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, growth always did, but they would face them as themselves, wholly and honestly, supported by a community that had learned to value truth over reputation, justice over comfort, and love over law. The cracked bell tolled the evening hour, its imperfect voice carrying across the valley, and Rosalie Pike, former saloon singer, current minister's wife, future teacher, present fighter for justice, listened to its song with a full heart. She had been broken and remade, tested and proven, revealed and accepted. Like the bell itself, her cracks had become part of her beauty, her damage transformed into her strength. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, not threatening now, but promising. Connection to the wider world, opportunities for their children, new stories yet to be written. But tonight, in this moment between rain and stars, past and future, Rosalie was simply grateful for the man beside her who'd chosen love over law, for the town that had become true sanctuary, for the grace that turned shame into testimony, secrets into strength, and broken bells into beautiful music. The preacher's wife had finally confessed not in defeat, but in victory, and in that confession, she'd found not just forgiveness, but freedom, not just acceptance, but purpose, not just survival, but abundant life, flowing like water in the desert, clear and inexhaustible and free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts about Rosalie and Jonah's journey. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help more people discover these stories of love, redemption, and courage in the American frontier. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to share more stories with you.